The rattling crack of gunfire echoed through Promise Creek as Tabitha Winters stood frozen on the dusty Main Street, her heart pounding beneath her corset. It wasn't the first time bullets had torn through the peaceful Montana afternoon, but it was the first time they'd been aimed at her father's bank with her inside it. The year was 1878, and the West was still wild enough to make a woman's life precarious, especially a woman like Tabitha. At 22, she had already made enemies of half the town simply by having opinions and the nerve to voice them. As the only daughter of the town's banker, she had advantages most didn't: education back east, fine clothes, and a position that commanded respect. But those privileges came with expectations she'd never been able to fulfill. "Get down, Miss Winters." A strong hand pulled her behind the heavy oak counter as another volley of bullets shattered the front window, sending glass raining across the polished floor. Tabitha found herself pressed against the chest of Quentin Blackwood, her father's newest hire. 6 feet of lean muscle and quiet competence, he'd arrived in Promise Creek just 3 months ago with little more than his horse, his gun, and a recommendation letter that her father had scrutinized for nearly an hour before hiring him as security. "Are you hurt?" His voice was steady despite the chaos, his blue eyes scanning her face with genuine concern. "No," she managed, her voice surprisingly calm, "but my father is safe in the back vault with the others." Quentin's hand remained on her arm, steadying her. "Those men out there aren't after the money, Miss Winters. They're Tucker's men." A chill ran through her at the name. Clayton Tucker, the cattle baron who'd been trying to buy her father's bank for the past year and who'd made it abundantly clear that he considered Tabitha's outspoken support of the homesteaders a personal affront. "This is about the foreclosures," she whispered, understanding dawning. "Father refused to call in the homesteaders' loans early like Tucker wanted," Quentin nodded grimly. "And everyone knows you're the one who convinced him to give them an extension through the harvest." Another shot rang out, closer this time. Quentin's body tensed, and without warning, he drew his Colt revolver from its holster. "Stay here," he commanded. "I need to get a better look at what we're dealing with. I'm coming with you." Tabitha gathered her skirts, ready to follow. The look he gave her could have frozen a desert. "No, you're not. This is my father's bank, Mr. Blackwood, and those are my father's customers they're threatening. I won't cower while, Miss Winters." His voice was low but firm. "I admire your courage, but right now the best thing you can do is stay alive. Because if they take you hostage, your father will give them whatever they want." The truth of his words stopped her. Reluctantly, she nodded. "Be careful, Mr. Blackwood." Something flickered in his eyes, surprise, perhaps, that she'd yielded so easily. He gave a short nod before moving in a crouch toward the shattered window, keeping to the shadows. Tabitha watched him, admiring despite herself the fluid way he moved, like a mountain lion stalking its prey. Quentin Blackwood was not like the other men her father had hired over the years. There was something in his eyes, a haunted quality that spoke of a past filled with more than just the usual hardships of frontier life. From her position behind the counter, she could see little of what was happening outside. But she could hear the shouts growing closer, the demands for William Winters to show his face if he wants to keep his daughter alive. The irony might have made her laugh if she weren't so terrified. Clayton Tucker had spent the better part of a year spreading rumors that she was a troublemaker, a bluestocking with dangerous ideas about women's rights and fair treatment for immigrants and homesteaders. He'd turned half the town against her, and yet here he was, using her as leverage. A sudden silence fell, more unnerving than the gunfire. Then a voice called out, closer than before. "We know the girl's in there, Winters. Send her out and nobody else gets hurt." Tabitha's blood ran cold. They knew she was inside. Which meant someone had told them, someone who'd seen her enter the bank earlier that day. The thought had barely formed when a shadow fell across her hiding place. She looked up, expecting to see Quentin, but instead found herself staring into the leering face of a stranger. Before she could scream, a dirty hand clamped over her mouth and she was hauled to her feet. "Got her, boys," the man called out, dragging her toward the door. "Looks like we won't be needing to negotiate after all." Tabitha fought like a wildcat, kicking and clawing at her captor. She managed to sink her teeth into the hand covering her mouth, earning a howl of pain and a vicious backhand that sent her reeling. "You'll pay for that." The words died in his throat as the unmistakable click of a hammer being cocked echoed in the sudden silence. "Let her go." Quentin's voice was calm, almost conversational, but the gun he held to the back of the man's head spoke volumes. "You're outnumbered, Cowboy," the man snarled, though Tabitha felt his grip loosen slightly. "Tucker's got 10 men out there, all itching to put a bullet in someone." "Then it seems we're at an impasse." Quentin didn't lower his gun. "Except for one thing, those men out there. They're getting paid to risk their lives. I'm doing this for free." There was something in his tone, a cold certainty that sent shivers down Tabitha's spine. This was not the quiet, respectful man who tipped his hat to her every morning for the past 3 months. This was someone else entirely, someone dangerous. The standoff lasted only seconds, but to Tabitha, it felt like hours. Then, surprisingly, her captor released her with a bitter laugh. "You're a dead man walking, Blackwood. Tucker won't stop till he gets what he wants. He's welcome to try." Quentin's eyes never left the man as he backed away, pulling Tabitha with him toward the rear of the bank. "Miss Winters, we're leaving. Now." "My father is already out the back with the others. Sheriff's deputies got them out while these fools were focused on the front." He kept his gun trained on the doorway as they retreated. "There's a horse waiting in the alley. Can you ride astride?" The question startled her. Ladies didn't ride astride, they used side saddles, a far more dangerous but proper way to sit a horse. But one look at Quentin's face told her this wasn't the time for propriety. "Yes," she said firmly. "I can ride. Good, because we're about to ride hard and fast." His eyes met hers, and for the first time she saw a flicker of uncertainty. "Do you trust me, Miss Winters?" It was a strange question from a man she barely knew, and yet, as gunfire erupted once more at the front of the bank, she found herself nodding. "Yes, Mr. Blackwood, I trust you." The look of relief on his face was brief but unmistakable. Without another word, he led her through the back door and into the blinding sunlight of the alley. True to his word, a horse waited, not the sleek black stallion she'd seen him ride, but a sturdy pinto mare already saddled. In one smooth motion, he lifted her onto the horse's back, then swung up behind her. His arms came around her to take the reins, and before she could catch her breath, they were galloping down the alley toward the open country beyond. Tabitha had grown up on horseback, but never had she ridden like this, pressed against a man's chest, the thunder of hooves matching her racing heart as they fled the town she'd called home all her life. Behind them, shouts and occasional gunfire faded into the distance as Quentin guided the mare onto a deer trail that wound up into the forested foothills. They rode in silence for what seemed like hours, the horse maintaining a grueling pace that spoke to both its quality and the urgency of their flight. Only when they reached a swift-flowing creek did Quentin finally rein in, allowing the exhausted animal to drink. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice close to her ear. Tabitha realized she was trembling, though whether from fear, exertion, or the strange intimacy of their position, she couldn't say. "Yes," she managed. "Where are we going?" Quentin dismounted in one fluid movement, then reached up to help her down. His hands at her waist were strong and sure, but he released her the moment her feet touched the ground, as if worried about impropriety even now. "There's a line shack about 3 miles west of here," he said, leading the horse to drink. "It belongs to the Mason spread. The old man died last winter, and his son's been in Denver trying to sell the place. It should be empty and safe enough for tonight." "Tonight," alarm rose in her voice. "Mr. Blackwood, I can't stay out overnight with," she stopped, suddenly aware of how ridiculous her concerns about reputation seemed when compared to the very real threat of Tucker's men. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "Your reputation will survive, Miss Winters. Your father knows you're with me, and right now, that's the safest place you can be." "How can you be sure?" "Tucker has a small army of men," Quentin's face hardened, "because Tucker's men are cowards who prey on the weak. They won't come after us, not when they know I'm with you." There was a story there, Tabitha sensed. Something personal between this quiet cowboy and Clayton Tucker, but before she could ask, Quentin was helping her back onto the horse. "We should keep moving," he said, mounting behind her. I don't want to be caught in the open after dark. The lined shack was exactly as Quentin had described, small, dusty, but solid enough to provide shelter. A single room with a stone fireplace, rough plank walls, and a narrow cot in one corner. Quentin lit a lamp he found on a shelf, illuminating the sparse interior. "It's not the Grand Hotel," he said apologetically, "but it's dry and defensible." Tabitha sank onto a rickety chair, suddenly aware of every ache in her body. The events of the day crashed over her like a wave, leaving her dizzy with exhaustion. Why is Tucker doing this? She asked, watching as Quentin checked the perimeter, securing doors and windows with a practiced efficiency that spoke of years of caution. "There are other banks, other towns." Quentin paused, his back to her. "It's not about the bank, Miss Winters, it's about control. Men like Tucker can't stand being defied, especially by a woman." "I've never defied him," she protested. "I've simply spoken the truth about his business practices." Now Quentin did turn, and the look in his eyes was both admiring and sad. That's defiance enough in his eyes. "You've stood up for people he considers beneath notice: homesteaders, immigrants, workers. Worse, people listen to you, respect you." He crossed to the fireplace, kneeling to build a small fire against the evening chill. "I've known men like Clayton Tucker my whole life, Miss Winters. They don't see people, they see possessions. Things to be owned or obstacles to be removed." The bitterness in his voice caught her attention. "You speak as if from personal experience, Mr. Blackwood." His hands stilled for a moment among the kindling. "Let's just say I have my reasons for wanting to see Tucker fail." The fire caught, casting flickering shadows across his face, a face that Tabitha realized she'd been observing far more closely than propriety allowed these past months. There was a nobility in his profile, a strength that had nothing to do with physical power and everything to do with character. "Mr. Blackwood," she said softly, "I think perhaps it's time you called me Tabitha. After all, we've now fled a bank robbery together and are spending the night in a deserted cabin. I believe that constitutes an introduction beyond formalities." The laugh that escaped him seemed to surprise them, both a warm, genuine sound that transformed his solemn features into something approaching boyish. "In that case, I'm Quentin, though most folks just call me Quinn." "Quinn," she repeated, liking the way it felt on her tongue. Simple, strong. Like him, he stood brushing dust from his hands. "You should rest, Miss Tabitha. Take the cot, I'll keep watch." "And where will you sleep?" "I've slept on harder floors than this one." He gestured to the planks beside the door. "Besides, someone needs to stay alert. Tucker's men might be cowards, but they're determined cowards." Tabitha wanted to argue, to insist that he needed rest as well, but the events of the day were catching up with her. Her eyelids felt heavy, and the small cot suddenly looked as inviting as the finest feather bed. "Wake me in a few hours," she said, moving toward the cot. "You'll need to rest too." Quinn nodded, though something in his eyes told her he had no intention of waking her. Stubborn man, she'd deal with that later. For now, she was simply grateful for his presence, this quiet, mysterious cowboy who'd risked his life for hers without hesitation. As she lay down, not even bothering to remove her boots, a thought occurred to her. "Quinn," she murmured, already half asleep. "How did you know?" "About the back door, the horse. It's almost as if you were expecting this." There was a long pause before he answered, his voice low in the dimness. "Let's just say I've learned to plan for trouble, especially when it involves people I care about." The words followed her into sleep, warming her more effectively than the small fire or the threadbare blanket he'd draped over her. Tabitha woke to the smell of coffee and the soft sounds of movement. For a moment, she couldn't remember where she was or why her body ached as if she'd been thrown from a horse. Then the events of the previous day rushed back, and she sat up with a gasp. "Easy," Quinn's voice came from near the fireplace, where he was tending a small pot. "You're safe." The relief that washed over her at the sight of him was almost embarrassing in its intensity. In the pale morning light filtering through the cabin's single window, he looked tired but alert, his lean face shadowed with stubble. "You didn't wake me," she accused, swinging her legs over the side of the cot. He shrugged, pouring coffee into a battered tin cup. "You needed the rest more than I did." He handed her the cup, his fingers briefly brushing hers. "It's not your father's fancy blend, but it's hot. Thank you." She cradled the cup, letting its warmth seep into her hands. What happens now? Quinn settled across from her, his own cup balanced on his knee. That depends. Tucker's not the type to give up easily, but he's also not foolish enough to invite open warfare. My guess is he'll regroup, maybe try to make it look like yesterday was just a misunderstanding. A misunderstanding, incredulity raised her voice. His men shot up my father's bank and tried to abduct me. And if the sheriff asks, they'll claim they thought it was being robbed and were trying to help. Quinn's expression was grim. Men like Tucker don't play by the same rules as the rest of us, Tabitha. They make their own, and they have enough money to make sure others follow them. The bitter truth of his words settled between them. Tabitha had spent enough time watching her father navigate the complicated politics of frontier banking to know Quinn was right. Money spoke louder than justice out here, and Clayton Tucker had more money than anyone in 3 counties. So we just, let him win? The very idea made her blood boil. Let him drive out the homesteaders, buy up their land for pennies, and expand his empire. A small smile touched Quinn's lips. I didn't say that. I said he doesn't play by the rules, neither do we. We. The word hung in the air between them, full of promise and danger. Quinn set down his cup and leaned forward, his blue eyes intense. Tucker wants your father's bank because it's the only thing standing between him and complete control of this valley. The homesteaders get their loans from your father. The merchants depend on him for credit. Even the railroad had to negotiate with him for right-of-way. And my father's not for sale, Tabitha said proudly. Exactly, which is why Tucker's trying to force his hand. Quinn ran a hand through his dark hair, a gesture she was beginning to recognize as a sign of deep thought. But what if there was a way to turn the tables, to make Tucker the one scrambling to save himself? How? He has more men, more money, more influence with the territorial governor, but he doesn't have this. Quinn reached into his shirt and withdrew a folded paper, yellowed with age and worn at the creases. He handed it to her with a gravity that made her handle it as if it were made of glass. Carefully, she unfolded it. It appeared to be some kind of deed or land grant, written in a formal hand that was difficult to decipher. But the name at the top leapt out at her. Blackwood. I don't understand, she said, looking up at him in confusion. Quinn took a deep breath, as if preparing to share a burden he'd carried alone for too long. That paper is a land grant, signed by the governor of the Montana Territory in 1863. It grants to Thomas Blackwood and his heirs the water rights to the North Fork of the Clearwater River. Tabitha's eyes widened as the implications sank in. The North Fork of the Clearwater was the main water source for the entire valley, including Clayton Tucker's massive cattle operation. Thomas Blackwood, she repeated. Your father, Quinn nodded, his expression unreadable. My father came west in '60, worked as a trapper until he saved enough to buy land. He was a visionary, saw that whoever controlled the water in this country controlled everything. He filed the claim legally, paid for it fair and square. But Tucker's been using that water for years, Tabitha said, her mind racing. How could he not know about this grant? A shadow crossed Quinn's face. Because my father died before he could enforce it. Winter of '64, I was just a boy. He paused, and Tabitha sensed there was more to the story, much more, but he continued without elaborating. By the time I was old enough to understand what I had, Tucker had already established himself as the big man in these parts. So you came back to claim what's yours, Tabitha said softly, beginning to understand. That's why you took the job at the bank. You were gathering information, planning your move against Tucker. Not just for the land, Quinn said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. For justice. The word hung between them, heavy with unspoken pain. Tabitha wanted to ask more, to understand the shadows that darkened his eyes whenever Tucker's name was mentioned. But something told her Quinn would share his story when he was ready, and not before. Instead, she focused on the practical. This grant, it's legally binding. After all these years. According to the lawyer I consulted in Helena, yes. There's no statute of limitations on a legal land grant, especially when the rightful owner can be proven to be a direct descendant of the original grantee. Hope flared within her, bright and dangerous. Then we have leverage, real leverage. Quinn's smile was slow but genuine. We do. The question is, how do we use it? For the next hour, they sat before the dying fire, plotting and planning. Quinn's knowledge of water rights law surprised her until he explained that he'd spent the past 5 years educating himself, preparing for this moment. "You're not just a cowboy," she said, shaking her head in wonder. He laughed softly. "I'm many things, Tabitha Winters. Cowboy is just the most visible." Their plan, when it finally took shape, was both simple and audacious. They would return to town openly, but not before sending word ahead to certain key allies, the newspaper editor who'd been looking for a story to break Tucker's hold on local advertising, the circuit judge who'd long resented Tucker's influence, and most importantly, Tabitha's father, whose financial backing would be essential. "It's risky," Quinn warned as they prepared to leave the cabin. "Tucker won't take this lying down. He'll fight, and he fights dirty." Tabitha met his gaze steadily. "So do I, when necessary." The ride back to Promise Creek was tense but uneventful. They took a roundabout route, avoiding the main trails where Tucker's men might be watching. By mid-afternoon, they were approaching the town from the north, keeping to the cover of the pine forest that bordered the settlement. "We'll go to Judge Harmon's house first," Quinn decided, reining in at the edge of the trees. "He lives on the north end of town, away from prying eyes." Tabitha nodded, her stomach knotting with anticipation and fear. She'd spent her life in Promise Creek, had never imagined becoming embroiled in what amounted to a range war. Yet here she was, plotting with a mysterious cowboy to bring down the most powerful man in the territory. "Are you afraid?" she asked suddenly, needing to know. Quinn considered the question, his eyes scanning the distant rooftops of the town. "Not of dying," he said finally. "I've lived with that possibility for too long to fear it, but I am afraid of failing, of letting Tucker win again. The word confirmed what she'd suspected, that there was history between Quinn and Tucker, something personal and painful. "We won't fail," she said with more confidence than she felt. "Not with both of us fighting for what's right." The look he gave her then was unlike any she'd received before, not the condescending amusement men often directed at her feminine notions, nor the grudging respect some granted her intelligence. This was something deeper, a recognition of shared purpose and mutual respect that made her heart beat faster. "Then let's go change some fortunes," he said, extending his hand to help her remount the horse. Judge Harmon's surprise at finding Tabitha Winters and Quentin Blackwood on his doorstep quickly gave way to keen interest as Quinn laid out their plan. A man in his 60s with a reputation for scrupulous fairness, Harmon had been a thorn in Tucker's side for years. "This grant," he said, examining the yellowed document with careful fingers, "it's genuine and potentially devastating to Tucker's operations." He looked up, his bushy eyebrows drawn together. "You realize he'll come after you with everything he has once you make this public." "That's counting on it," Quinn said grimly. "We need him to overreact to show everyone exactly who and what he is." The judge nodded slowly. "A dangerous game, but one worth playing." He turned to Tabitha. "And you, young lady, are you prepared for what this might cost you? Your standing in the community, perhaps even your safety." Tabitha straightened her spine. "Judge Harmon, my standing in this community has always been precarious at best. As for my safety," she glanced at Quinn, "I believe that's in good hands." The old judge's eyes moved between them, something knowing in his gaze. "I see. Well then, let me send for your father. I believe we have a conspiracy to organize." William Winters arrived within the hour, his relief at seeing his daughter safe quickly replaced by calculated interest as Quinn once again explained their plan. Unlike the judge, Winters was a cautious man by nature. He had to be, as a banker in frontier territory. But he was also a man of principle, one who had resisted Tucker's pressures and threats for years. "It could work," he said finally, pacing the judge's study. "If we move quickly, if we secure the right allies." He stopped, fixing Quinn with a penetrating stare. "But I must ask, Mr. Blackwood, why now? You've had this grant for years, by your own admission. Why choose this moment to use it?" Quinn met the older man's gaze steadily. "Because now I have something worth fighting for beyond revenge." The simple honesty of the statement hung in the air. Tabitha felt her cheeks warm as her father's eyes flicked to her, then back to Quinn. "I see," William Winters said, in much the same tone the judge had used earlier. "Then let us proceed." Tucker has called a town meeting for tomorrow ostensibly to discuss yesterday's unfortunate incident at the bank. It would seem the perfect stage for our announcement. The next 24 hours passed in a blur of preparation. Messages were sent, allies cultivated, documents prepared. Tabitha worked alongside Quinn, her father, and the judge, drafting statements and organizing support. By the time the town meeting was set to begin, she was exhausted but exhilarated, filled with a sense of purpose that made every risk worthwhile. "Are you ready?" Quinn asked quietly as they stood at the back of the crowded town hall. Clayton Tucker was at the front, his imposing figure commanding attention as he expressed his deep concern over the outbreak of lawlessness that had threatened the bank. Tabitha smoothed her skirts, her heart pounding but her resolve firm. "I've been ready my whole life, I think." The ghost of a smile touched his lips. "So have I." Together they moved through the crowd, which parted before them like water. A hush fell as people recognized Tabitha, who many had believed fled or captured, walking confidently beside the tall cowboy who'd become her unexpected champion. Clayton Tucker's voice faltered mid-sentence as he spotted them. A man in his 50s, heavyset but still powerful, with a florid face and cold eyes, he recovered quickly, his mouth twisting into a semblance of welcome. "Miss Winters, we've been concerned for your safety. I'm glad to see you've returned unharmed from your adventure." The condescension in his tone was palpable, designed to put her in her place, the silly girl who'd needed rescuing from a situation of her own making. Once, it might have intimidated her. Now, it only strengthened her resolve. "Mr. Tucker," she said, her voice clear and carrying to every corner of the hall. "How kind of you to express concern, especially considering it was your men who created the danger in the first place." A murmur ran through the crowd. Tucker's face darkened. "That's a serious accusation, Miss Winters." "One I must categorically deny. My men were responding to what appeared to be a robbery in progress. By attempting to abduct the banker's daughter." Quinn's voice was deceptively mild, but there was steel beneath it. "An unusual response to a bank robbery, wouldn't you say?" Tucker's eyes narrowed as they fixed on Quinn. "I don't believe we've been formally introduced, Mr. Blackwood," Quinn said. "Quentin Blackwood." The effect of the name was subtle but unmistakable. Tucker's confidence faltered for just a moment, a flicker of something recognition, alarm. Crossing his face before he mastered it. "Blackwood," he repeated, "not a common name in these parts." "But not unknown," Quinn replied. "My father, Thomas Blackwood, was one of the first settlers in this valley. His name might be familiar to you." Now the alarm in Tucker's eyes was unmistakable. He knew exactly who Thomas Blackwood was and what his son's presence might mean. Judge Harmon chose that moment to step forward, the yellowed land grant in his hands. "Mr. Tucker, as the circuit judge for this district, I've been asked to authenticate a legal document that I believe will be of great interest to you and the citizens of Promise Creek." What followed was a masterclass in legal and moral justice. As the judge read aloud the terms of the grant, the crowd's reaction shifted from confusion to dawning understanding. Water rights were the lifeblood of any ranching operation, and Tucker's empire depended entirely on his unfettered access to the Clearwater. "This grant has never been superseded or legally transferred," the judge concluded, "which means that Mr. Blackwood here is the legal owner of the water rights that currently supply not only Mr. Tucker's ranch, but much of the surrounding valley." The silence that followed was deafening. Then Tucker laughed, a harsh sound devoid of humor. "A clever trick, Judge, but ultimately meaningless. That paper might be legal, but laws are only as strong as the men willing to enforce them." His gaze swept the room, settling on the sheriff, a man long in his pocket. "And in case you've forgotten, I am the law in Promise Creek." "Not anymore." William Winters stepped forward, his dignified presence commanding attention. "As of this morning, I have telegraphed the territorial governor with evidence of your intimidation tactics, your attempts to force illegal foreclosures, and your direct assault on my bank." The U.S. Marshal is already on his way, Mr. Tucker. Your reign is over. The room erupted in chaos, shouts, accusations, even a few cheers from those who had long suffered under Tucker's oppressive rule. Through it all, Tucker stood motionless, his face a mask of fury and disbelief. Then, with a movement so sudden it took everyone by surprise, he drew his pistol and aimed it directly at Quinn. "You think you can come back after all these years and take what's mine?" he snarled. "You're as much a fool as your father was." The crowd scattered, leaving a clear space around the three of them, Quinn standing tall and unflinching, Tabitha at his side, and Tucker with his gun leveled at Quinn's heart. "My father," Quinn said quietly, "was an honest man who believed in the law. That was his only foolishness." Something dark and terrible twisted Tucker's features. The law is what I say it is. It was true then, and it's true now." And in that moment, Tabitha understood. The pieces fell into place: Quinn's vendetta against Tucker, his years of preparation, the pain that shadowed his eyes whenever Tucker's name was mentioned. "You killed his father," she said, her voice barely above a whisper but somehow cutting through the tension like a knife. "That's what this is really about, isn't it? Not just the land or the water rights. You murdered Thomas Blackwood." Tucker's eyes flicked to her, momentarily distracted. "Clever girl, too clever for your own good, just like your friend here." His finger tightened on the trigger. Some lessons need to be taught more than once, it seems. What happened next seemed to unfold in slow motion. Tucker's gun shifted, aiming not at Quinn but at Tabitha. Quinn moved with the fluid grace of a man who'd spent his life preparing for this moment, stepping in front of her even as he drew his own weapon. Two shots rang out almost simultaneously, the sound deafening in the enclosed space. Tucker staggered backward, a look of almost comical surprise on his face as a red stain blossomed on his chest. His gun clattered to the floor unfired. Behind him stood Sheriff Davis, his own pistol still smoking. "That's enough, Clayton," he said quietly. "It's over." The silence that followed was absolute. Then Tucker collapsed, his massive frame hitting the floor with a thud that seemed to shake the very foundations of the building. In the chaos that followed, Tabitha was aware of only one thing: Quinn's arms around her, solid and real, his heartbeat strong against her cheek as he held her close. "Are you all right?" he murmured against her hair. She nodded, unable to form words past the lump in her throat. They were alive. Against all odds, they had faced down the most powerful man in the territory and survived. Later, after the doctor had pronounced Tucker dead, and the sheriff had taken statements from a dozen witnesses, all confirming that Tucker had drawn first with clear intent to kill, Tabitha found herself sitting beside Quinn on the steps of the town hall. The evening was drawing in, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson that seemed too beautiful for a day marked by violence and death. Yet there was peace too, a sense that a long shadow had lifted from Promise Creek. "What happens now?" she asked, echoing her question from that morning in the lined shack. But this time, the answer felt very different. Quinn was silent for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the distant mountains. "The water rights belong to the valley now," he said finally. "I've already spoken with your father and Judge Harmon about creating a water district, ensuring fair access for everyone: homesteaders, ranchers, the town itself." "That's remarkably generous," Tabitha said, studying his profile in the fading light. "After everything Tucker did, everything he took from you." "What Tucker took can't be restored with water rights or land," Quinn said softly. "My father is still gone. Nothing changes that." Impulsively, she reached for his hand, her fingers twining with his. "But justice has been served. Your father would be proud." He looked down at their joined hands, then up at her face, his blue eyes reflecting the sunset. "There's something else my father used to say, that a man is truly wealthy when he has something worth more to him than gold or land." The meaning behind his words made her heart race. "And have you found that, Quinn Blackwood?" "I believe I have," he said, his voice low and certain. "If she'll have me." The world seemed to still around them, the sounds of the town fading away until there was nothing but this moment, this man, and the future suddenly opening before them. "She will," Tabitha whispered, and when his lips met hers, she knew that this not the water rights or Tucker's defeat was the true victory they'd won. The news of Clayton Tucker's death and the revelation of his crimes spread across the territory like wildfire. The U.S. Marshal arrived 2 days later, bringing with him federal agents who uncovered evidence of years of corruption, intimidation, and yes, murder. Thomas Blackwood's death, long ruled an accident, was reopened as a homicide investigation, with several of Tucker's former men coming forward to testify in exchange for leniency. For Tabitha and Quinn, the weeks that followed were a whirlwind of depositions, legal proceedings, and planning. The Water District was established, with Quinn elected as its first commissioner, a position he accepted with reluctance, but growing determination to ensure that what happened under Tucker's reign would never happen again. Tabitha, meanwhile, found herself becoming the voice of Promise Creek's renewal. Her articles in the local newspaper, thoughtful pieces about justice, community responsibility, and the importance of standing against tyranny were reprinted in papers as far away as Denver and San Francisco. Even those who had once disparaged her as a troublemaker began to seek her opinion on matters ranging from the new school building to the proposed railway expansion. "You've become quite the local hero," Quinn teased one evening as they walked along the creek that had become the symbol of their victory. "I heard Mrs. Hendricks, who once called you a meddlesome bluestocking, if I recall telling the ladies' auxiliary that you should run for town council." Tabitha laughed, the sound echoing across the water. "And what did you say to that suggestion?" "I said they'd be fools not to elect you." He squeezed her hand, his expression growing serious. "You've always seen what this place could be, Tabitha. Now others are starting to see it too." She stopped, turning to face him fully. In the golden light of late afternoon, with the creek murmuring beside them and the mountains rising purple in the distance, Quinn Blackwood looked like everything she'd never known she wanted: strong, principled, and completely devoted to her. "I couldn't have done any of it without you," she said softly. "That's not true," he countered. "You were changing things long before I arrived, standing up for the homesteaders, fighting for fair treatment of the Chinese workers, challenging Tucker's control of the town council. All I did was provide a legal document at the right moment, and save my life," she reminded him. "Twice, if we're counting." His smile faded, replaced by an intensity that still took her breath away. "I would save it 1,000 times over, Tabitha Winters, but what I'd rather do is share it." Before she could respond, he reached into his pocket and withdrew a small object that caught the sunlight like a captured star. A ring, a simple gold band set with a single, perfect diamond. "It was my mother's," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "My father gave it to her when they decided to come west together. He said she was the bravest woman he'd ever known, taking a chance on a new life with a man who had nothing but dreams and determination." He took a deep breath. "Until I met you, I didn't understand what he meant." Tabitha felt tears well in her eyes as Quinn dropped to one knee before her, the ring held out like an offering. "Tabitha Winters, I came to Promise Creek seeking justice, but I found something far more precious. I found you your courage, your compassion, your unshakable belief in what's right. I love you more than I ever thought possible, and if you'll have me, I want to spend the rest of my life at your side." The tears spilled over, but Tabitha was smiling through them, her heart so full it seemed impossible that her body could contain such joy. "Yes," she whispered, then louder, "Yes, Quinn Blackwood, I will marry you." He slipped the ring onto her finger, then rose to gather her in his arms, lifting her off her feet in an embrace that spoke of all the love and hope and future promises between them. Their wedding, held that autumn in the newly rebuilt church, was attended by nearly everyone in Promise Creek. Even those who had once been Tucker's strongest supporters came to witness the union of the woman who had stood against him and the man who had helped bring him to justice. "Never thought I'd see the day," old Judge Harmon remarked to William Winters as they watched the couple exchange vows. "Those two are as different as can be, her with her books and ideas, him with his hard frontier ways, yet somehow they fit." Winters nodded, his eyes misting as he watched his daughter pledge her life to the man who had saved her in more ways than one. "Love finds a way, Judge, always has, always will. And so it did, through the years that followed. Quinn and Tabitha Blackwood became the heart of Promise Creek, as it grew from a frontier settlement into a proper town. Their home, built on land that had once belonged to Quinn's father, became a gathering place for everyone from politicians to homesteaders, a place where ideas were exchanged and alliances formed that would shape the future of the territory. They had children, 2 sons and a daughter, all with their mother's spirit and their father's quiet strength. They weathered droughts and blizzards, economic downturns and political upheavals. Through it all, their partnership remained unshakable, a testament to what could be achieved when courage and conviction were matched with love. Perhaps most remarkable of all was the way Tabitha's former enemies came to respect her. The very people who had once whispered behind her back now sought her counsel, acknowledging that her troublemaking had, in fact, saved their community from a tyrant's control. "She's blessed, Mrs. Hendricks was overheard saying at the town's Founders' Day celebration, 5 years after Tucker's death. "Truly blessed with that husband who looks at her like she hung the moon, those beautiful children, and that way she has of making everyone feel heard. Blessed." Her companion replied with a knowing smile. "Perhaps, but don't forget she earned every bit of it standing up to Tucker when the rest of us were too afraid to speak." Mrs. Hendricks nodded solemnly. "That's the truth. I used to think her a fool for challenging him. Now I thank God every day that she did. We all do." The conversation drifted to Quinn, who was across the square, their youngest child perched on his shoulders as he pointed out the new clock tower. And that man of hers who would have thought a quiet cowboy like that could change so much. "Love," Mrs. Hendricks said with the wisdom of her years. "Love changes everything. He loved her so deeply, even her enemies came to call her blessed." The words, spoken casually during a community celebration, somehow captured the essence of what had happened in Promise Creek. A woman of principle, a man seeking justice, and the love that had transformed not just their lives but an entire community. That night, as Quinn and Tabitha stood on the porch of their home, watching the stars emerge above the mountains that had witnessed their journey from strangers to beloved partners, he told her what he'd overheard. "Even her enemies called her blessed," he repeated, drawing her close against the evening chill. "They got it half right." Tabitha looked up at him, curious. Only half, his smile, still as heart-stopping as it had been that day by the creek, was tender in the fading light. "It's not just your enemies who call you blessed, Tabitha Blackwood. It's everyone whose life you've touched, especially me." She rose on tiptoe to kiss him, this man who had ridden into her life like a hero from a dime novel but had proven to be something far more valuable, a partner in every sense of the word. "We blessed each other," she whispered against his lips, "and that's the greatest justice of all." As the years passed, their story became legend in the growing state of Montana, the banker's daughter and the avenging cowboy who had brought down a tyrant and built something beautiful in the aftermath. But for Quinn and Tabitha, the true miracle was simpler and more profound. The love they found in each other, a love that had not only changed their lives but had somehow, against all odds, changed the world around them for the better. And in the end, isn't that the most powerful legacy any of us can hope for? Not wealth or fame or even justice, but love, the kind of love that transforms not just 2 people, but everyone whose lives they touch. The kind of love that endures, that builds rather than destroys, that heals old wounds and creates new possibilities. The kind of love that Quentin Blackwood and Tabitha Winters found in Promise Creek, in that tumultuous year of 1878, when a quest for justice led to something far more precious. A future built on courage, conviction, and a bond that even their enemies came to respect. In their twilight years, when their children had children of their own and Promise Creek had grown into a thriving center of commerce and culture, Quinn and Tabitha would often return to that spot by the creek where he had proposed. There, with the water flowing steadily as it had for centuries, they would remember how it all began with a banker's daughter who refused to be silenced, and a cowboy who loved her enough to stand with her against the most powerful forces in the territory. And in the legacy, they built together a legacy of fairness, courage, and unwavering love. They found the truest blessing of all. A life well lived, hand in hand, changing the world one principle, one stand, one act of love at a time.